I want to start out with just what we already know. We're very blessed in our country. America's been blessed in many ways. And I just want to take you through some of them and then kind of set up where I want to head this morning. You look at what we have with our governing documents. We have been under those governing documents longer than any other nation in the history of the world, 237 years. And when you look at the 195 nations we have at the UN this year, no one comes close to the stability we've enjoyed. As such stability, we take it for granted. But if you look at what we've had, France, in the same period of time, we've had one constitution, they've had 15. You take any nation you want to and look at any continent you want to and look at how frequent turmoil and instability and revolution occurs, and then realize that nobody walked through those doors and decided what chair we're going to dive under if rebel forces come in here and start shooting. That doesn't cross our mind. I mean, you imagine being in somewhere even, we think of South Korea is very positive, and they are, but they've had 6 constitutions since 1948. If you're 90 years old in Poland, you've lived through 7 revolutions in your life. I mean, it's unbelievable. We never think like that. So we're blessed with stability. We're also blessed with creativity in a way that we just don't understand. When you look at what we have in America, we're not a big nation. We have 4% of the world's population, and yet every year we produce more inventions, more patents, more copyrights, more symphonies, more iPhones, more anything you want than the other 96% of the world combined. Now, 4% of the world should produce 4% of the world's anything, but it doesn't. Our 4% produces more than the other 96%. And then if you look even at our prosperity, we have that same 4% that we have in prosperity, but yet our 4% produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product. Now, we don't produce more because we have more, because that's not the case at all. I mean, quite frankly, America, only 1% of Americans are farmers and ranchers, and yet that 1% feeds the entire world. And it's not because we've got more farmland and ranch land, because we don't. America's only 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land. And yet we take what we have and produce more than anybody else in the world. So we're blessed. We're blessed in ways that sometimes we don't even think about. I mean, if you take what the Census Bureau says, and every 10 years we do this enumeration of the people, the Census Bureau, based on their figures, if you happen to live below the poverty level in America, and we don't want anybody living below the poverty level in America, but if you do, if you live below the poverty level in America, according to figures from the Census Bureau, you're more likely to have a telephone, a television, you're more likely to have an air-conditioned automobile. Grab this, you're more likely to eat more red meat and have more square footage of living space than the average middle class in Europe. Did you get that? If you're in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the lifestyle in the second richest place on the face of the earth, which is Western Europe. So if you're in poverty here, you're more prosperous than somebody in the middle class in Europe. See, that's why everybody in the world wants to come to America and live in poverty. If they can be in poverty here, they've raised their lifestyle from anywhere in the world. I mean, now, we've been blessed in a lot of ways that we're just so used to it, we don't think about how different we are from other nations. But those who came here understood. Way back in 1831, a guy gave us the phrase American exceptionalism. Alexis de Tocqueville, who did Democracy in America, he said, man, the condition of the Americans is exceptional. I don't think anyone else will ever be able to do what they've done. And today, when you look into our textbooks, as we teach our young people, we say, well, kids, who's responsible for what we enjoy? And I've been appointed in a bunch of states by state boards of education to write the history and government standards in those states. So California and Texas and Kentucky and Oklahoma and all these different states. And I see what's in textbooks. And invariably, if we're going to talk about what makes America different, we immediately go to our political leaders. We say, well, you got George Washington, you've also got Thomas Jefferson, of course there's John Hancock, and there's John Adams, and it's great that we go to all these great founding fathers because they played a significant role, but the difference is 200 years ago, if you would ask them who's responsible for what we enjoy in America today, they would have given you a whole different answer. And John Adams is a great example. In 1818, 42 years after the American Revolution, when Adams is an old man, a young historian called Hezekiah Niles came to him and said, you know, all the stuff we have and enjoy, we weren't there, we didn't see it, but we've got it. Who's responsible for it? I mean, you were back there, you saw it. Who's responsible for all the stuff we enjoy today? And old man Adams said, well, if you want to know who's responsible for what we have today, he said, right up top, you got to put the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, and there's the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. Oh, you got George Whitefield. Oh, don't forget the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He goes through and starts listing preachers. Now, that's not what we study in textbooks today. But there's an eyewitness pointing to all these preachers saying these are the guys responsible. You know, today maybe we know who Whitfield is, but the chances that we know who Cooper or Mayhew or Chauncey, we don't have a clue. We don't know these guys. We don't study these guys at the founding, whether they're white preachers or black preachers. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Morant or Lemuel Haynes? All these preachers, black and white, that had such a huge impact in the founding, we won't even touch them today. As a matter of fact, in one of the states where we were recently doing history standards, when we got into the civil rights era, we talked about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, or at least we talked about Dr. Martin Luther King. I said, let's make sure and call him the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King because he was a pastor, and they said, oh no, you can't do that. I said, well wait, he's a pastor. His famous letter from Birmingham jail that we have kids read, that was a letter written to other pastors saying, what the heck are you guys doing on the sidelines? Have you not read the Bible? You got to be out here in the middle of what's going on. I mean, the whole thing, he was a pastor. And they said, yeah, but we can't put that in the textbooks. Really? You can't say that Dr. Martin Luther King was the Reverend Dr. Martin? No, we don't do that in our textbooks today. And so we don't even mention folks like, you know, just a great example of a guy we used to study is a guy named Harry Hoosier. Now, Harry Hoosier was a black evangelist in the First Great Awakening. He's in there with George Whitfield and Samuel Davies and Gilbert Tennant, and he's in there with Coke and Asbury and all these famous preachers, except he drew crowds larger than the other guys. Matter of fact, signer of the Declaration, Benjamin Rush, said that he listened to him. He said he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Now, he's heard Patrick Henry, and he's heard all those, and he said, no, Harry Hoosier's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Now, Harry loved to preach, but he didn't like to preach where everybody else preached. He went out to the really wildest parts of America where nobody else went, and that's where he preached. So, by the way, anybody recognize the word Hoosier there? Yeah. Does it seem familiar? See, the wildest parts of America back then were the Indiana frontier. And so he goes out and preaches all these wild men in the Indiana frontier, and as they get converted and come to Christ, their friends say, what happened to him? He's one of those Hoosier guys. I wonder how many folks in Indiana know they've been named for a black evangelist. Probably none. Probably none. But see, that's what we used to study in history, but we don't do that anymore. Now, why in the world would John Adams have pointed to all these preachers and said, these are the guys responsible? Answer is very simple. If you take the Declaration of Independence, or birth certificate that he signed, they start up top with 155 words that set forth the 6 principles of American government. They follow that with 27 grievances explaining why America separated and became an independent nation, and historians have documented that every single one of the rights set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. Now, you know what that means? That means the Declaration of Independence is nothing more than a list of the sermons we've been preaching in church for 20 years leading up to the Revolution. You ever read the Declaration of Independence and wondered how many sermons you could get out of there? That's what we did back there. That's what it was. It was a listing of sermons we heard in church. And the British understood that it was the preachers who made America. As a matter of fact, the British called them the Black Robe Regiment because all the preachers back then wore black robes, and they blamed the preachers for what happened. They said if it hadn't been for those American preachers, for that Black Robe Regiment, America would still be a happy British colony. Therefore, when they came to America, they went for the preachers. And that's who they wanted to shut up. You see, when they landed, for example, in New York City, they got to America earlier than that, but in New York City in 1777, when they sent troops to New York City, there were 19 churches in the city. They burned 10 to the ground, desecrated the other 9. They went across Virginia burning churches, across Maine burning churches, across New Jersey burning churches, because these are the guys responsible for all the stuff that's going on. You got to silence those churches. And so that was the target, and that's what they did. But what in the world were we preaching back then that would have caused such a reaction in our cultures? What was it that we were preaching that John Adams and other political leaders say, you want to know what made America great? You go to the pulpit. Well, you look at sermons like this. Now, this is called an election sermon. We're very blessed in our organization. We own 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I own thousands of handwritten documents of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all these guys we've just been looking at. And we own thousands of sermons out of the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, all these sermons from across American history. And this is the oldest traditional form of sermon we had in America. It's called an annual sermon. And an annual sermon is a sermon that you preach every year. An Easter sermon is an annual sermon, a Thanksgiving sermon is an annual sermon, a Christmas sermon is an annual sermon, an election sermon was an annual sermon in America for 270 years. because you see, America started with the elections back in 1619. We chose our own leaders. And so in selecting our own leaders, we said, well, we know out of Romans and out of Titus and out of 1 Peter and out of Hebrews that government is ordained by God. So what kind of government did God ordain here? Well, he ordained self-government. We get to choose our leaders. Well, if he ordained self-government, what does the Bible tell us about how to choose our leaders? And that's why starting in 1633, we started having a sermon every single year on what the Bible said about the form of government we have in this nation and choosing our own particular type of leaders. By the way, there are 7 forms of government in the world. The Bible mentions all 7. The Bible specifically endorses what we call a republican form of government. That's what the founding fathers took and chose. They pointed to Exodus 18:21. They pointed to Deuteronomy 1:15 and 16, Deuteronomy 16:18 as the reason we have a republican form of government. That's why Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution requires that every state maintain a republican form of government. That is the biblical preferred form of government. So we started preaching about that way back in 1633, and for 270 years, every single year, we covered what the Bible said about elections and choosing the right type of leaders and why you had to put the right kind of... This was an emphasis in the church for 270 years. Now, I've chosen some other sermons to show you from back in that period. I chose them because you'll recognize the names. This one, for example, a sermon preached before His Excellency John Hancock, signer of the Declaration, but he's the governor of Massachusetts. And in front of Samuel Adams, he's signer of the Declaration. He's the father of the American Revolution. He's the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And it's a sermon in front of the Council, Senate, and House of Representatives. Do you know, for 170 years, we started state legislative sessions by having a joint session of the legislature. You got everybody together, the governor, lieutenant governor, House, and got them all together, and you brought a preacher in to talk to the entire... That's how you started legislative sessions? Now, let's just pretend you get home in a couple of days and you check your answering machine and you got a message in your answering machine from the governor. He says, you know, I've got a special session coming up. I'm going to have everybody there. All the state government's going to be there. I want you to preach a sermon to the entire state government assembled on that day. If most Christians today had an opportunity to preach a sermon, one shot at the entire state government, what do you think we'd do? We'd preach a killer salvation message. Oh, that's great. That's what those guys need. But you see, that's the problem with the church today. We've become really good at making converts of all men, but not very good at making disciples of all men. Because you see, back then in that day, we knew that there were 613 civil laws, that there's nothing that comes up in civil government that God hasn't addressed. Matter of fact, we would look at people like Nehemiah when he was rebuilding the walls, getting things established in Jerusalem. We say, he passed laws on military stuff. He passed laws on agricultural stuff. He passed laws on immigration. He passed laws on banking. He passed laws on marriage. He passed laws, anything you want to name, he was dealing with. God's Word deals with every aspect. So what we did for 170 years, whatever the issue was facing the legislature, we would say, oh, debt is the issue. Let us show you what the Bible says about debt and what the government cannot do and what the government can do to stay out of debt. Oh, by the way, you think you want to raise taxes? That's okay if your taxes are this, this, and this, but the Bible specifically condemns the capital gains tax. The Bible condemns an estate tax. The Bible condemns progressive taxes. You can use these forms of taxes, but not these forms. And whatever the issue is, education, we'll talk about education. Whatever the issue was facing the state, the Bible addressed it, and we used to know that. We used to know that the Bible addresses every aspect of life, and that's why we had these sermons. Here's another one, a sermon in front of Samuel Huntington. Now, Samuel Huntington, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Here's one in front of Oliver Wolcott. He's signer of the Declaration of the General Assembly of Connecticut. Now, if we tried to do something like this today, you know, like I know that they would scream to high heaven and say, that's unconstitutional. Time out. It's the guys who wrote the documents who were doing this. So how unconstitutional is that? See, what's happened is we've been changed in the way we think about stuff. Here's even a sermon, a voice of warning to Christians on the ensuing election of a president of the United States. Really? We had sermons like that? Absolutely. Why did we do that? Because that's what you find in the Bible. Well, really? Well, think back about it. Remember when Elijah was just about to jump national leaders Ahab and Jezebel? Elijah was just about to say, we haven't had rain in this nation for 3.5 years because of your wicked policies. What you did with eminent domain with Naboth, and, I mean, he went through all the policies, all these governmental policies. He was just about to jump them on that when, fortunately, he remembered his 501c3 tax exemption and kept his mouth shut. Don't think so. And you know, Nathan and Gad was just about to jump David and say, David, thou art the man. What you've done with Bathsheba, what you've done with you. And fortunately, they remembered their 501c3 tax exemption and kept their mouth. No, Throughout the Bible, God's ministers are always the main ones in speaking into the civil arena. They're the ones who call out the civil leaders. Even Jesus called Herod an old fox and called out the civil leaders a bunch of whitewashed sepulchres. You know, we wouldn't think about doing in the pulpit today what Jesus Christ himself did with civil leaders back in the New Testament. See, that's why we used to have these kind of sermons. It's only been since 1954 with what's called the Lyndon Baines Johnson Amendment that we've been told that the church is not to talk about stuff like that. Now, the problem we have here is a problem that came really from the Supreme Court. I've been involved in 7 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court, but what the court did back in a case called Everson versus Board of Education, they said, you know, religion is really important in America. That's our history, that's our heritage, that's our tradition. That's why we have the First Amendment to protect your religious faith. It's important, but starting now, we need you to practice your faith in private. We do it at home or at church. We don't need it out in public. I mean, if you love praying, pray all you want to. Let's just not have prayers at football games anymore. And if you like the 10 Commandments, man, hang them in the foyer churches. Let's just not put them up inside the courthouses any longer. And if you like nativity scene, put one up over the mantelpiece at Christmas time. Really lovely fireplace and nativity scene. But let's just not have them in city parks anymore. And so what's happened for the last 5 decades or so, we've been told that we're supposed to compartmentalize our faith. You see, the Bible and Christianity goes over here, but education goes over here. And the Bible and Christianity goes here, but law and government politics are over here, you know, separation of church and state. And the Bible and Christianity goes here, but here's health care over here, and here's economics over here, and here's athletics over here, and entertainment. All this stuff, what's happened as a result of that, most Christians today think that there's a difference between the secular and the spiritual, and there is not. I guarantee you God looks at everything through the filter of His Word. I mean, we will not be watching the great judgment and watch all these people come by and be judged, and here comes a guy, and God says, whoa, time out, that guy was involved in politics. My word doesn't apply to him. He's off the hook. Not going to happen. God's Word applies to every single aspect of life, and we've gotten into this thing of compartmentalizing our faith. Now, and having said that, you look back in American history, and there's a church historian by the name of Charles Galloway who deals with this, but I want to show you a Bible verse that I think summarizes where we are right now. This Bible verse is out of Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. In the King James, it says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I love this verse in the Phillips translation. In the Phillips translation, it says, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. And in a very real sense, Christians have allowed non-Christians who don't even like us to tell us what we can and can't do in society. They tell us where we can and can't speak, what we can and can't say, what we can and can't be involved with. Wait a minute. I don't need my enemies defining my role. The Word of God defines my role very clearly. That's the role of God. On top of that, I have history, and on top of that, I have the Constitution. I've got 3 things that define my role. My critics don't need to be the ones defining my role and telling me what I can and can't talk about. Now, within that framework, you go back to Charles Galloway, this church historian. He looked back at the founding of America, and this is what he said about the preachers back then. He says, mighty men they were, men of iron nerve and strong hand and unblenched cheek and heart of flame, and I don't think that's the way the New York Times describes preachers anymore today. I don't think they're even close to that. He says, God needed not reeds shaken by the wind, nor men clothed in soft raiment, but He needed heroes of hardihood and lofty courage, and such were the sons of the mighty who responded to the divine call. Let me give you an example. Go back to the start of the American Revolution. You remember that night when they were watching to see what the British were going to do as they got off the ships, where the British troops going. That begins the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Well, we get the idea that Paul Revere is just riding across the state, giving the alarm. Everybody watch out, here comes the enemy. Not so. He was specifically riding that night with a deliberate intent and purpose. He had to find John Hancock, and he had to find Sam Adams. The reason is very simple. I actually have the order that the 700 British troops set out that night, and I have the order that their commander gave them. The order says, bring back to me the bodies of Hancock and Adams. These are the 2 guys that are all the troublemaker. I want to see their dead bodies right in front of me. Now, you 700 go find them and get them back here. So what's happened is Hancock is looking, Revere is looking to find these 2 guys and let them know that there's 700 soldiers coming for you. And so, man, if you're on horseback, you got the primitive communication they had back then. Where do you go in the state to find these 2 leaders who are always all over the state? They're doing all these rallies and the Sons of Liberty and just keeping all these guys. Where do you go to find them? I mean, you got to find them on short. Well, everybody knew where they stayed. They stayed at the preacher's house, Reverend Jonas Clark's house. That's exactly where Revere was riding, was to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. And when word got to the Reverend Jonas Clark, they Hancock and Adams looked at Clark and said, "Pastor, are your people ready for this?" He got indignant and backed up and got stiff-backed and said, "Of course they are." He said, "I've trained them for this very hour." Well, the next morning, the alarm bells went off as the British approached the town, and that's where we have the Battle of Lexington. It was 70 guys from his church that went out there and took on 700 British guys who were coming at the town. Now, when the battle was over, there were 18 Americans laying on the ground. Those Americans included white patriots like John Robbins, black patriots like Prince Estabrook, black and white. They all went to church together. We never talk about that in American history, just like we never talk about all those black preachers who had such an impact. That's such a neglected side of history. I'm not going to spend much time on it this morning, but I just want to acknowledge that it's there. But you have 18 Americans shot down at that point, black and white, going to church together, laying on the ground side by side. They stood up against the 700 British coming against their town. The British then go from Lexington, they go further west, they get to Concord. And the Bridge of Concord, when they got to, and see, Pastor Clark had told his guys something they didn't want to hear. And he told his guys, he said, "Look, guys, here's the way this is. You cannot start this thing. You cannot fire the first shot. God will not bless an offensive war. He will bless a defensive war. If you're defending yourself, he'll bless that. But you can't start this," which is why the British got the first shot. So when you have 700 guys taking the first shot at 70 guys, that's kind of why it was lopsided. 18 Americans on the ground, no British on the ground. But now the British have started something. Now we're allowed to fire back. Now we have the biblical right of self-defense. And so when the British got to the bridge, the North Bridge at Concord, waiting to meet them there was the Reverend William Emerson and 300 guys there waiting for the British. And since they've been fired on, they can now fire back, and they've returned fire, and that's where the first British hit the ground. The British looked on this and said, "This is not going well. We first faced 70 guys, now we've got 300 guys. We're not ready for this. We need to get back to Charleston," which is near Boston. So they start marching 19 miles back to the east, going back where they had started out from. Headed back, and the problem they had was along the way, they found thousands of Americans lining the road on both sides. I mean, the British had to run a lead gauntlet to get back to Boston. Now, where'd all these guys come from? Well, it's interesting to see who they were. For example, along the road there, you had the Reverend William Payson, who took a group of men from his church to attack the British as they went back to Boston. Now, I love the Reverend Jonathan French. He was in the pulpit when he heard what happened. Reverend Jonathan French, he left from his pulpit to go to Boston with a musket in one hand and a surgical bag in the other. Now, I'm not quite sure how that works. I guess you shoot them and then fix them. I'm not sure how that works. But again, it was the pastors who were out in the middle of all this stuff that's going on. 6 weeks later, you had the Battle of Bunker Hill. And by the way, the guy who painted this, John Trumbull, painted the hero of Bunker Hill. And this guy right over here, you see that black man right there? Peter Salem. Peter Salem was the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, standing beside Thomas Grosvenor, again, black and white, side by side, which is so often the image we had. It's not the image we get today. Peter Salem actually saved countless lives that day. He got more than a dozen military commendations presented to the commander-in-chief. They built monuments to him. But nonetheless, as the Battle of Bunker Hill is going on, across the country, word goes out that, hey, our brethren are under attack in Boston. So from across the country, you had people start heading to Boston, and a lot of them didn't get there in time, but that wasn't the point. We got to get down there and support our brethren. And it's interesting to see, for example, up in Vermont, you had the Reverend David Avery, who grabbed 20 guys out of his church and headed for Bunker Hill. And again, didn't get there in time, but it was the thing, we've got to go stand with our brethren. Now, interestingly, America had only 3 million people back then. So as remote as Vermont was, if you had 20 people in a church in Vermont, that was a mega church in Vermont. And quite frankly, given the spiritual condition of Vermont today, if you got 20 people in a church, it's still a mega church in Vermont. So out of New Hampshire, Reverend Stephen Farrar grabbed 97 guys out of his church and headed there. Across town on the other side of Boston, you had the Reverend Joseph Willard, who formed 2 fill companies out of his church, headed over to Bunker Hill. Down in Pennsylvania, you got the Reverend John Steele with 900 guys out of his church. And down in Virginia, you got the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg with 300 guys out of his. This is the way it went across the Revolution. Now, the church was on the forefront of anything that was happening. I mean, we weren't waiting to see, we weren't reading the news, we were making the news. We were out there in the middle of what went on. Now, it's interesting that we were involved militarily, but as was pointed out by great historian J.T. Headley, he said the patriotic clergy of the Revolution were the soundest statesmen of the time. And why not? Because we knew what the Word of God said about every civil issue that was out there. 613 civil laws, we knew them. And so it's interesting that when you look at what happened, for example, when we did the Declaration of Independence, What we did was we wiped out state governments. So in wiping out state governments, because they were all 13 British-run governments, we know the Bible says you're not to be without government. That's a God-ordained institution. He doesn't want anarchy. So what we did was these guys, after writing the Declaration, returned to their homes and started passing their very first state constitutions. Now, you look at those constitutions, you got the 1776 Constitution of New Jersey, 1776 Constitution of Virginia, 1776 Constitution of North Carolina and South Carolina and Pennsylvania. You go through all these different constitutions. It is amazing how many of those constitutions were written by preachers of the gospel. Constitution after constitution written by, see, we never studied that these long-lasting constitutions, the first ones written by preachers, absolutely, because they were the greatest statesmen of the time. After the American Revolution, we get into what went on with the Constitution 11 years later. We rarely point out, I ask kids all the time, who do you recognize up there? And, you know, a few of them can get folks like George Washington, a few of them get Ben Franklin, and they rarely go any further than that. They would never be able to point out to you, for example, the second guy on the back row back there. That is Abraham Baldwin. He's the youngest theologian in America. He actually founded the University of Georgia as a school to train ministers of the gospel. You also have seated at the table here, these guys right here. The guy on the left side, the guy on the left side of the table right there, that is William Samuel Johnson. He's a theologian from New York. The guy right beside him is Roger Sherman, a theologian from Connecticut. The guy leaning over the table is William Livingston, a theologian from New Jersey. It's amazing how many of these guys were preachers that were involved in that. And that's why it's not surprising that if you know the Bible, and if you know how to recognize Bible verses, and if you will read the Constitution, you find Bible verses all over the Constitution. Now, there's a lot of books out there that they say, oh no, the Constitution is a godless document written by godless guys. You know, when somebody tells me the Constitution is a godless document, what they have just told me is that they are biblically illiterate. They wouldn't recognize a Bible verse if it bit them on the ankle, because the Constitution is loaded up with Bible verses. Then after we get the Constitution done, we've got to ratify it now. So where do you send a government document to have it ratified? Well, obviously to the state capitol. No, 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 no. If you're in states like Massachusetts, North Carolina, the ratification conventions for the U.S. Constitution were held in churches, not in government buildings. And in each state, you had to elect specific ratifying delegates to represent that state to ratify the Constitution. And 44 of the ratifying delegates were preachers of the gospel. I mean, we're involved in all sorts of civil stuff. And that's why when you look back at what America is and what America has become, quite frankly, with all the blessings we have and all these things, and by the way, one other document I'll show you, the 1791 we did, well, 1791 we ratified the Bill of Rights. It was actually done in 1789. The 1790 we get ratified. So 1791, the Bill of Rights goes into effect. And when you look at the bottom of the Bill of Rights, there are actually two signatures there. One, John Adams, Vice President of the United States, which means he's President of the Senate. The other is Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, Speaker of the House. Now, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg is the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. The first Speaker of the House of Representatives was a preacher, yeah, and a whole bunch of the members of Congress were also preachers. Now, these guys gave us the First Amendment not because it guaranteed separation of church and state. It says no such thing. It guaranteed the free exercise of religion. The reason that's significant is Reverend Muhlenberg down here at the bottom, this guy, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, he was in his church in 1777 when the British arrived in New York City. He had been telling his brother, who was involved down in Virginia, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who led the 300 men out of his church, he said, hey, you're a pastor, you're not supposed to get involved in this stuff. And he wrote back, he said, I'm a pastor, that's true. He said, but I'm also a citizen, and I have the duties of a pastor and of a citizen, which means I have duties to God and to country. And he said, by the way, you wouldn't have the liberty to stand in your pulpit in New York and do what you do if it wasn't for people like me going out to defend your right. And his brother in New York said, no, 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 no. Here in New York, we're in good shape. British like us. You got a bunch of hotheads in Virginia. You got Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, those guys. We don't have that in New York. The British came in the next year, and they threw him out of his church, and that's when they burned those 10 to the ground, desecrated the 9. He watched as his own church was being desecrated, and he suddenly has an epiphany. And he says, you know, I think I need to get involved in this thing after all. And he did. And he's the first Speaker of the House of Representatives and is loaded up with all these preachers. They didn't give us separation of church and state. They guaranteed the free exercise of religion. You see, when you look back and look at American history, no question about it, if it had not been for the church and church leaders and pastors, we wouldn't have America as we know America today. Now, what's happened is we've been told we're not supposed to be involved in this stuff anymore. So I want to take you in and show you biblically why we are. I want to talk to you about biblical principles and political process. And in doing that, I want to take you to the city of of San Antonio. San Antonio, like many other cities across the United States, has passed what are called NDOs, non-discrimination ordinances, and nobody pays any attention to them. But in San Antonio, there was this really crazy Christian guy. I mean, he's just wacky because he attended every city council meeting. He was afraid they might slip something through that would affect Christians and nobody would know about it. So he may be the only guy in the city council chamber, but he attended every, and sure enough, they slipped this non-discrimination ordinance through, and he alerted the other guys, and they said, oh no, surely wouldn't, because you see what they did in the non-discrimination ordinance of San Antonio, which is like so many other cities that nobody ever pays attention to, is they put in a provision that says, you know, if you publicly disagree with homosexuality or homosexual marriage, if you stand for traditional marriage, if you criticize homosexuality or homosexual marriage, according to city law in San Antonio now, number one, you're dismissed from office. So if I've been elected to office by the voters, and I say, wait a minute, I believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, I'm dismissed because it's called malfeasance from office. You will be dropped from office in San Antonio if you stand up for traditional marriage. On top of that, they made it a Class C misdemeanor. So it's now a crime if I say that marriage is between a man and a woman and homosexuality is wrong. And on top of that, it's a $500 a day fine to do that. And while we're at it, I'm also prohibited from running for office at any time in the future. So if I'm a preacher and I say homosexuality, the Bible's very clear in Romans 1 and all these other passages, if that sermon's ever been taped, I can now legally be prohibited from ever. You can't keep me from running for office. It's my constitutional right. Yeah, and on top of that, they also said that you can do no business with the city. So if I have a paving company, if I have a flower company, if I have a landscape company, whatever it is, I'm not allowed to do any business with the city of San Antonio if I hold that marriage is between a man and a woman and homosexuality is wrong. Now, you look at that, and anybody in their right mind says they can't do that because we have constitutionally given rights. I have the right for my freedom of religion, and you can't infringe that. That's a constitutional guarantee. I have a right for the freedom of association. I can choose who I want to hang out with and who I don't want to hang out with. I can choose what groups I want to be part of and what group, and if that means marriage is a man and woman, that's the group I want to be part of. I've got the right to choose it. And by the way, I've also got my freedom of speech. I can say what I like, and you can't do anything. Yeah, we have the mistake of thinking that our rights are constitutionally given, which they are, but the problem is they're politically protected. And if you don't have the political protection to do what the Constitution says you can do, then you can't do what the Constitution says you can do. It's real simple. They just proved that in San Antonio. Now, in San Antonio, as a result of this one guy seeing what happened, 300 churches got up in arms and said, whoa, you're not going to do that. So now you got 300 churches that are organizing to take back the city and see what they can do. We'll see what happens about that. That's a story to come later. But this thing about being politically protected, that our rights are constitutional. See, we think the Constitution governs America, and that is a complete myth. And I say that because the Founding Fathers who wrote the Constitution said that. 55 guys drafted the Constitution. One of those 55 is John Francis Mercer. John Francis Mercer, on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, while he's helping draft the Constitution, reminded the other Founding Fathers. He said, remember, he said, it's a great mistake to suppose the paper we're to propose will govern the United States. If you think the Constitution governs America, he said, you are dead wrong. He said, we all know that. He said, we know it's not the Constitution. It's the men that the Constitution will bring into the government, the interests they have in maintaining it that will govern them. He said, the Constitution will only mark out the mode and the form, but men are the substance and members to the business. Only thing the Constitution's good for is to show you how to get people in office. But if you put the wrong kind of people in office, it doesn't matter what your document says, they will do what they want to do when they get there. So it comes back to the Constitution is really the mechanism for us to have elections and put the right kind of people in. And if we refuse to participate in that, it doesn't matter how good the document is, you will get non-discrimination ordinances just like you got from San Antonio. So our rights are constitutionally given. They have to be politically protected. You know, there's a biblical parallel to that. In the Bible, we are told in the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18-20, to preach the gospel to every creature, right? Mandate. We're told to do that. We believe in obeying God's word. So we're going to head to Saudi Arabia, jump up on a corner, and start preaching the gospel in Saudi Arabia. And as soon as you do, you'll find the same problem a pastor recently found who did that. He got arrested, charged with blasphemy. He's waiting to be beheaded. Because you see, even though our rights are biblically given, they are also politically protected. And in Saudi Arabia, you don't have the political protection to do what God tells you to do. In China, you don't have that protection. And so many, in America we do, but we're losing that protection in America because we refuse to get involved in the process. You see, that's why we have a pastor in Phoenix, Arizona, who spent 90 days in jail because he had a Bible study in his home, because the city of Phoenix passed an ordinance that says it's illegal to have a Bible study in your home. Wait a minute, you can't do that. That's my biblical right. Yeah, but it's got to be politically protected. If it's not politically protected, it doesn't matter what the Bible says. You can do it, but you're going to have to pay a penalty for it. We've always been able to do what the Bible said without paying a penalty for it in America because we've always had leaders there who respected what God said and respected what is. But if we refuse to put those kind of leaders in, and see, that leads us right back to what we have with San Antonio. San Antonio has, well, I'm going to come back to San Antonio later, so let me skip that for right now. Let me just say that in talking about the political process, I want to establish the standard that was raised by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, we learned in school, was a great civil rights leader. What we don't learn in school was he was a great preacher. He was an AME Zion minister. So we never get told that this great political guy who served in 4 different presidential administrations was also a minister of the gospel. Well, here's a preacher involved in politics, and he erected a standard that is the right standard for every Christian. Every time you look at politics, this is a standard. This is what he said. He said, I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one. It's widely and generally assented to, nevertheless it's generally trampled on and disregarded. He said, the standard I use for political involvement is everybody says, oh, that's good, but very few people actually follow through with it. He says, the best expression of it I found in the Bible, it is in substance, righteousness exalts a nation, but sins a reproach to any people. He said, that's my political standard. He says, this constitutes my politics. The negative and the positive of my politics and the whole of my politics. What I'm for and what I'm against is based on whether it's righteousness in God's eyes or not. Real simple. He says, I feel it my duty to do all of my power to infuse this idea into the public mind. This is the basis of political involvement. Now, we recognize that verse as Proverbs 14:34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sins a reproach to any people. But the question then becomes, how is the righteousness of a nation measured? I mean, if righteousness exalts a nation, and if righteousness exalts a state, or a county, or a city, or a school board, or anything else, how does God measure that right? How does God measure the righteousness of a nation? How does He measure the righteousness of a state? How does He measure the righteousness of a county? How does He measure the righteousness of a city? And the answer is, He measures it by the public policies that they enact. That's what, it doesn't matter what they say, it matters what they do. The policies they put in place, God, throughout the Bible, the only way He measures righteousness of a nation or any political entity is by the measures that they enact. And that's why Ahab was about to jump, that's why Elijah was going to jump Ahab and Jezebel, and Nathan and Gad were going to jump David. Public policies, and that's what they measure. Now, the interesting part about this is a public policy affects every single person within that political entity, even those that disagree with the policy. They all get affected by it. There's no way that a public policy does not have an impact on every. Now, why is that? Well, why would that be the case? Let me take you back to the Constitutional Convention because they had a discussion on this very point. At the Constitutional Convention, one of the 55 guys who framed the Constitution was a guy named George Mason. George Mason's from Virginia. George Mason owned slaves in Virginia. He refused to sign the Constitution because it did not abolish slavery. Wait a minute. A slave owner that wants the Constitution to abolish slavery? What's going on here? The state of Virginia made it illegal to free your own slaves. So he's a guy who's opposed to slavery, but by state law in Virginia, he can't free his own slaves. He said, guys, the Constitution did not end slavery. I'm not going to sign the Constitution. Now, why would he do that? Because he said, what we have just done by keeping constitutions alive is we've invited God's judgment on the nation. This is the way he explained it. He says, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. He says, by an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Now, we all know someday we'll be resurrected, we'll stand before the judgment, we've got the blood of Christ, we're in good shape, but we know that there will be a future judgment for every individual in the face of it. It doesn't work that way for nations. God is not going to resurrect the Soviet Union at the end of the days and say, all right, Soviet Union, account for what you did. He's not going to resurrect Hitler's Nazi regime at the end of the days and say, okay, tell me why the government. Now, He will judge individuals on that. But He does not judge nations. He judges nations only at the time that something happens. If they make an Ahab Jezebel policy, you'll go without rain for 3.5 years. On the other hand, if they make a righteous policy, God will bless and prosper and send the latter rain and the former rain and all the other stuff. So it's all based on the political entities and the stand that they take, and God will respond to that right now. And that's what He said. He said, man, there is no way that God's going to let us get away with having slavery and not do something to the nation. It is interesting that Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, he says, this is the national judgment that we knew was coming. God is not going to let all that blood that's been spilled on the back of slaves go without judgment. Read his second inaugural address. It's the most profound spiritual political message you'll ever see, and it is on this very basis. You see, in the same way, you go back to these sermons that were held in front of the legislatures. In 1791, the Reverend Chandler Robbins addressed the legislature of Massachusetts. And that's when John Hancock and Sam Adams were there, and he specifically told the legislature of Massachusetts, he said, "The supreme governor of the world rewards or punishes nations and civil communities only in this life. Political bodies are but the creatures of time. They have no existence as such, but in the present state. Consequently, they're incapable of punishments or rewards in the future." He says, "We can conceive of no way in which the divine being shall therefore manifest the purity of his nature towards his societies, but by rewarding or punishing them here, according to their public conduct." He said, legislators, let me get your attention. Pay attention to this. God will take the policies you pass right now and bless them or curse them based on what you do right. Keep that in your mind when you pass legislation. If you want blessings on the state of Massachusetts, you've got to pass policies that God can bless. If you pass policy, see, that's the whole point he was telling these legislators is, guys, what you pass in the legislature will have an effect on every person in the state of Massachusetts right now, or in any other state for that matter. That's why leaders become so significant. So that's why when you look at Ahab and Jezebel, you remember, he singled them out for their wicked policy, 3.5 years of no rain. Yeah, but wait a minute. God told Elijah that I've got 7,000 guys who never bowed their knee to Baal. Remember that? Those 7,000 guys also went through 3.5 years of no rain. That's just the way the whole nation went through 3.5 years of no rain. It's a national judgment because God deals with political entities at this. And you see, that's why it's so significant that we get involved. If we refuse to get involved, righteousness exalts a nation. How do you get righteousness? It comes through public policies. It's the only way it happens. It's not because we pray more than other nations. That's a good policy. Now, we have a National Day of Prayer. That is a policy God can bless. He says, you honor me, I can honor you. I mean, we do things like that, but the fact that we as individuals like to pray a lot doesn't mean the nation gets blessed except by God answering our prayers. The nation gets blessed when the nation takes stands that God can bless. Does that make sense? Everybody understand the difference there? So, how do you get righteous policies enacted? Real simple. Proverbs 29:2 says that when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. You get the right kind of people in office, you get the right kind of policies. You get the wrong kind of people in office, you get the wrong kind of policies. It's real simple stuff. Now, let me show you next how we applied this principle of Proverbs 14:34 and Proverbs 29:2 in forming our new governments. I mentioned earlier that in the Revolution, what we did was, with the Declaration, we set aside all these British-run governments. So what happened was we had to create new constitutions, and it's interesting that of these 56 guys who signed the Declaration, so many of them immediately went home to start working on Constitution. By the way, we don't recognize these guys. I put this picture up recently at a very premier elite law school and asked the kids, and it's sharp kids, I said, who do you recognize? And they all recognized Jefferson and they all recognized Franklin, and that's where it stopped. I said, wait a minute, there's 56 guys up there, give me more than two, and they couldn't. So I said, well, let's just go across the front row. I mean, you got over here the guy sitting right here, that's Richard Henry Lee. Beside him is George Clinton. Beside him is Sam Adams. The guy looking backwards in the front row, that's Charles Carroll. Beside him in the light brown jacket is Robert Morris. Beside him is Benjamin Rush. Beside him is Robert Treat Paine, Elbridge Gerry leaning on his elbow. And beside him is Robert Treat Paine. So I went through all these guys, and they said, we've never heard of those guys before. You see, Americans have been trained to recognize our two least religious founding fathers. We can find the two least religious. We have no clue that 29 of these guys were involved in ministry or went through schools that were started to train ministers of the gospel. I mean, you have the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon right there. You have this man right here as a church music director and choir leader, Francis Hopkinson. You have this man right here, Robert Treat Paine, who is a chaplain in the military. You have this man right here who did the Thompson Bible, Charles Thompson. You have this man right here, Benjamin Rush, who started the first Bible Society in America. I can just go through these guys, show the Christian. We'll never cover those guys in history today. You see, we're all secular, and that's what we need is secular stuff. So we don't cover these guys, but yet these guys went home and said, no, we've got to go replace government because God does not want us to be lawless. And that's why you take in New Jersey, the Constitution of New Jersey, John Witherspoon signed the Declaration from New Jersey, went home to write the Constitution for 1776 in New Jersey, the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon. You have the same thing in Maryland where Charles Carroll of Carrollton went home to write the new Constitution for Maryland. Same thing, state after state. Take, for example, what you have in the state of Delaware. State of Delaware, a number of signers from Delaware were there at the signing the Declaration. Thomas McKean's from Delaware, as is George Reed, as is John Dickinson. And they went home and wrote the original 1776 Constitution for Delaware, and look what it requires. Every person who shall be chosen a member of either house must say, I do profess faith in God the Father and in the Lord Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God and blessed forevermore. And I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures, the Old and New Testament, to be given by divine inspiration. Now, I'll point out, we would love to have that as a requirement to get into Bible school today. But that used to be the requirement to serve in public. Now, what kind of laws do you think you'll get from that kind of person? Is there a chance that you might pass laws that exalt righteousness, that cause God to bless your state? You bet. And they understood that. Now, let's don't stop there. Let's go up here, for example, to Massachusetts. Massachusetts signers who went home to write their Constitution include Robert Treat Paine. You also have Sam Adams. You also have John Adams and John Hancock. And these guys go home to write the Constitution for Massachusetts, which requires any person chosen governor or lieutenant governor, councilor, senator, or representative must say, I do declare that I believe the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of its truth. Let's not stop with Massachusetts. Let's go on next to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, of all folks, is written by Ben Franklin, our least religious founding father, right? Look what Ben Franklin put in the 1776 Constitution of Pennsylvania. It says, and each member of the legislature shall say, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures, the Old and New Testament, to be given by divine inspiration. That's our least religious founding father, okay? We can't get most evangelicals to believe that today, and that was our least religious founding father back then. You've also got states like that of North Carolina. North Carolina required in their 1776 Constitution, no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Christian religion or the divine authority, either the Old or New Testaments, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department of this state. Real simple. You see, they understood that this is nothing more than Proverbs 29:2. When the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. Now, it does not take a hearing aid today to hear all the groaning that's going on. And what does that tell us? It tells us the wrong people are ruling. How did they get there? See, this is where it comes back to us. The only way they get there is because we put them in office or we refuse to get involved. Nobody gets there without our permission. Now, here's where it's a little self-examination time. We're told in 1 Corinthians 11:31, if you would judge yourselves, you would not need to be judged. So let's do a little house judgment here. Judgment begins first at the house of God, so let's do that. When you look at all the people who are capable of voting in the United States, 100% of voters, defined by the Constitution, if you're 18 years and older, you're capable of being a voter. So we have a voting capacity of 100% of adult-age population, 18. Of that group, do you know how many actually are willing to get involved in the process? In other words, are registered to vote. Only 67.1% of that group is registered to vote. So right off the bat, we've taken 1/3 of Americans who said, I refuse to be salt and light. I'm not going to do a single thing in this. It can go to hell in a handbasket, but I'm not going to raise a hand to stop it. So we've got only 2/3, 67.1%, that said I'm registered to vote. Now, when you come to a presidential year election, in a presidential year election, that's when you have the highest voter turnout of any other election. Every 4 years, we have high voter turnout. And what we have in that period of time is, since 1980, the average presidential election averages 54% of registered voters vote in that election. Now, that's 54% of registered voters. That's 54% of 67.1%, which means in a presidential election, only 36% of American adults vote in a presidential election. Since it only takes a majority to win, 18% choose the President of the United States. So what we're looking at is any president chosen since 1980, only 1 out of 6 Americans chose that president. 5 out of 6 did not choose the person who's President of the United States. If you don't like what any president did since 1980, you yell at the person who chose them? No, you yell at the 5 out of 6 who didn't do a single thing to stop that. It's not the person that's in office, it's the 5 out of 6 that didn't vote for that person. Now, 1 out of 6 did vote against that person, but the other 4 out of the 6 did absolutely nothing in that. Now, you're in an election year like this year, which is called an off-year election. Off-year elections, you don't have a president top of the ticket, so voter turnout goes down dramatically. What you face in an off-year election is 39% of registered voters vote. Now, 39% of 67.1% turns out to be 26% of adults will choose governors, will choose senators, choose members of the House of Representatives. 1 out of 4 Americans will vote, and which means it only takes the majority. So 13% of adults choose the governors of the United States this time, will choose their they're U.S. senators. That means only 1 out of 8 Americans choose the people that will rule us this time. 7 out of 8 will not be choosing our governor. This is not a good deal. I mean, the reason that low percentage, only 1 out of 8 Americans are choosing people in Congress. You know, perhaps that's why we see stories like this. Congressional approval sinks to record low, 9%. Well, it's about the percentage that voted for them. People who voted for them like them. That's it. Nobody else. Well, that's not the fault of the people who voted for them. That's the fault of everybody else. I love the way this was said by James A. Garfield. And James A. Garfield's the 20th President of the United States. Here's something you didn't learn in your school books about James A. Garfield. He's a famous preacher in the Second Great Awakening, that national revival. You mean he was a preacher and he's president? Yep. Matter of fact, here's one of the letters we own from James A. Garfield. This letter dated 1858. You see up top, signed at the bottom, James A. Garfield. In this letter, Garfield says he had just finished preaching a revival meeting where he preached the gospel 19 times or 19 discourses in that revival. As a result of his preaching, he said that 34 folks came to Christ and he baptized 31 by immersion. Now, somehow, that doesn't seem like a typical presidential activity today, but that's what presidents use. See, back then when we thought that preachers should be involved in every aspect of the world, see, today we've been told, you stay behind that little 2-foot square right there and don't leave it. This is your spot. Don't say anything about what's going on out there, and no, we didn't buy that in previous days. But Garfield, 20th President of the United States, on the centennial anniversary of America, he told us something that applies today now that we're our second centennial. He says, now more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. He said, if that body be intelligent, brave, and pure, it's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature. He said, if the next centennial, where we are now, does not find us a great nation, it will be because those who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation do not aid in controlling the political forces. Bingo, here we are. We're the stewards over this thing. Now, going back to that, so this is the percentage that choose the winners on that. That's presidential elections, that's off-year elections. But what happens when you get to local elections like that in San Antonio? Well, in local elections in San Antonio, the voter turnout, now remember, these are the guys who criminalized saying that marriage should be between a man and a woman. The voter turnout was 6%. Now, that's 6% of registered voters, which means only 4% of adults actually voted in that election. And since it just takes a majority to win, it was 2% of San Antonio folks that voted for the current city council that they've got. The ones who enacted that really stupid non-discrimination, only 2% of the city. Do you think there's more than 2% of San Antonio that might be Christians? Might be biblical? Sure. Where are they? We're not getting involved in that stuff. As long as we're not going to get involved in that stuff, we'll keep getting the non-discrimination ordinances that keep coming out of cities like that. I mean, we're not the minority in this, not by a long shot. We just decided we want to tie our hands behind our back and sit down and let people punch us in the face all day long. You just can't do that for the sake of righteousness. So when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. That's the biblical mandate that really has to direct what we do in involvement. Now, having said that, let me point out that involvement is a biblical duty. Let me explain why. I mentioned to you before Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration. Dr. Benjamin Rush, he founded the first abolition society in America, a huge civil rights leader. He led the national abolition movement, started the abolition society in every state, helped form the first black denomination, AME denomination, trained the first black physicians. He did the first faith-based prison reform in America. He signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution, served in 3 different presidential administrations. He started 5 universities, 3 of them still go today. He was the director of the U.S. Mint. He is known as the father of American medicine. He found medical discoveries 200 years ago we still use today. 3,000 students got their medical diploma signed by him. He started the American College of Physicians. I mean, he started everything, it seems like. He started the Sunday school movement. He started the first Bible Society in America. He's an evangelical Christian, but he's also known as the father of public schools under the Constitution. And the reason was that after we did the Constitution in 1777, he ratified it in 1778, 1789, it goes into effect. For the first time, we are now a nation. We've been 13 nations up to this, but now we're a nation. And he wrote this piece in 1790, said, on the mode of education proper in a republic. Now that we're no longer 13 separate states but one nation, what do we have to teach our kids if we're going to remain a nation? What is required in our schools, because we have to teach stuff to keep us a nation. What's it going to be? And so this is where he laid, and this is why it's called the Father of Public Schools under the Constitution. Now, in this piece, he laid out and he said, the first responsibility of public schools in America is to teach students to love and serve God. He said the second responsibility of public schools in America is to teach students to love and serve their country. He said the third responsibility of public schools in America is to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, I want to direct your attention to the order. He said God, country, family. Every Christian with whom I've talked today says, no, 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 it's God, it's family, and it's country. Family is more important than country, and that's, I haven't heard any Christian who disagrees with that order right there. They all disagree with the order he gave it to. But why in the world did he put it God, and then country, and then family? Because he said if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy of the family. Ding, 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 we have a winner. See, look at everything we're fighting that's attacking our family. It's government policies that have come at us. Because we've gotten out of being involved with our country, it is now the great enemy of our family. It's destroying our communities, destroying so many things. See, that's why it's God first, country second, family third. If you want to protect your family, you get involved with making policies that will protect your family, and that's a political level. That's why Sam Adams said this way. Sam Adams says, every citizen will see, and I hope be deeply impressed with the sense of it, how exceedingly important it is to himself and how intimately the welfare of his children is connected with it, that those who are to have a share in making as well as in judging and executing the law should be men of singular wisdom and integrity. He said, for your kids' sake, you got to have the right kind of people in office. See, we understood that family was directly affected by government. And if we refuse to be involved in government, we have sacrificed our family to pressures that shouldn't be there. So that's why we have a duty to be involved. Now, there is a role for the church in this. Let me take you back to Charles Finney. He was part of the Second Great Awakening. Charles Finney grew up listening to the speeches of George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He saw the role of preachers in the Great Awakening and the American Revolution. He knew all of that. And in his era, the big issue was slavery. And so he was a national voice. I mean, I cannot tell you how influential he was with preachers. The writings he did for preachers, his books were all bestsellers, his systematic theology, his revival lectures, etc. And Charles Finney, talking to preachers in his day, said, guys, we've got to stand up. The slavery issue, the church has to take a position in this. We cannot be neutral. And so a university where he was president, the first university in America to treat blacks and whites, men and women as equals. It was the kids out of his university that really ran the Underground Railroad, getting slaves out of slavery in the South to freedom. And so that was, I mean, he was absolutely involved in the culture. And this is what he told the preachers in his day. And he was probably the most looked to guy in his generation as far as preachers are concerned. This is what he told them. He says, brethren, our preaching will bear its legitimate fruits. There is no way that what we say does not have a positive impact. It will bear fruit. He said, however, on the other hand, he says, if immorality prevails in the land, the fault's ours in great degree. Because of the power of the pulpit, because of the power of what we can do with the Word of God, if we have immorality, don't blame it on the other guys, you blame it on us. Now, I mean, if God wants to heal the nation, he says, if my people, he doesn't say if the pagans will get it all together. He said, if my people, he'll heal the nation if his people do what's right, we're not doing it. He said, if immorality prevails in the land, the fault's ours. He says, if there's a decay of conscience, the pulpit's responsible for it. He says, the public press lacks moral discrimination. The pulpit is responsible for it because we're not addressing those issues. He said, if the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit's responsible for it. He said, if the world loses its interest in religion, the pulpit's responsible for it. He says, if Satan rules in our halls of legislation, the pulpit is responsible for it. Wait a minute, that's not our fault that we got corrupt leaders. Yeah, it is, because we're the stewards of the nation. And when only 2% choose the leaders you have in a city, and only 13% choose the leaders you have in a state, and only 18% choose the leaders you have in a nation, yeah, if Satan rules in our halls of legislation, we're responsible for it. He said, if our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, the pulpit's responsible for it. Now, you take that and say, boy, that's where we are now. So what's the solution? Let me give you a biblical solution that, again, deals with government. I want to tell you the parable of the trees of the field. Parables of the trees of the field are told in Judges 9:18 through 15. I'll just read the scripture to you. It says, one day the trees went out to anoint a ruler for themselves. So trees of the field say, hey, we need civil government. That's God's institution. He ordained it. We need a ruler for ourselves. And so they went, first of all, to the olive tree, and they said to the olive tree, be our leader. But the olive tree answered and said, no way I'm going to do that. Said, should I give up my oil by which both gods and men are honored to hold sway over the trees? So next the trees went to the fig tree, and they said to the fig tree, come be our leader. But the fig tree replied, no way, I'm not going to get involved in that. Should I give up my fruit so good and sweet to hold sway over the trees? So next they went to the vine, and they said to the vine, come be our leader. And the vine answered and replied, no way. Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and men, to hold sway over the trees? And so it goes. And so what you see is they went to all these great trees and said, come be our leader, but all the great trees had good reasons why they couldn't do it. We're too busy. Got stuff going on with the kids. We got too many responsibilities. We got all these good reasons why we can't be the ones to step up and be leaders. Notice what happened next. In that parable it says, so finally all the trees said to the thorn bush, uh-oh, this is not going the right direction. Said to the thorn bush, finally all the trees said to the thorn bush, come be our ruler, come be our leader. And when you know it, that's the one that wanted to do it. Thornbush said, I'll be happy to. Thornbush said, if you really want to anoint me leader over you, come and take refuge in my shade. You got to be kidding me. How much fun is it to be in the shade of a thorn tree? And how good a fruit do you get off of a thorn tree? You had all these other options out there, and this is what we get stuck with. My contention is that right now we have way the heck too many thorn bushes ruling in America. Now, the reason, and by the way, I think I can prove this statistically. ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, does a survey every year to find out how much Americans know about their own nation. Now, if you come to America from the South Pole, you come to America from the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, you come to America from wherever, you never even heard the word America, but you want to live here, to become a citizen here, you have to go through a minimum amount of education and pass a 100-question immigration test. You have to know about our history, our country, et cetera. So you have to pass this 100-question immigration test just to be a citizen here. Well, what these guys did was they took citizens who have lived here their whole life, and they took the 13 easiest questions on the test, and let's say, you lived here your whole life. Let's ask you the 13 easy questions about what it takes to become a citizen. And what they found was that 71% of folks who have lived here their whole life don't know enough to be a citizen of the United States. But what they did, for the first time ever, they gave the same 13 questions to our political officials. And 78% of the officials failed the test. We may really be dumb in America, but we got stupid leaders. You know? Thorn bushes are ruling. Real easy. And they know less than the citizens know, but it's because we've all got good reasons on why we can't be involved. There's too many things we have to do. We're producing too much fruit. It's too good and too sweet, and too many people enjoy what we... No, as long as we've got that, we will have thorn bushes ruling. So, how do you avoid thorn bushes as rulers? We go back to the Bible. We go particularly to Exodus 18:21. Choose out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, rulers of tens. That is the Bible verse on which we got Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. That's a Republican form of government. You choose your leaders at the federal, at the state, at the county, and at the local level, and there's your qualifications for office. You choose able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Now, this thing about choosing, where do you find these kind of guys? Where do you find the Exodus 18:21 guys? Interestingly, that answer was given by Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin said, look at the Bible. God shows you where he chooses the best leaders. Look what Franklin said. He says, it's observable that God has often called men to places of dignity and honor when they have been busy in the honest employment of their vocation. Notice, Saul was seeking his father's asses and David keeping his father's sheep when they were called to the kingdom. The shepherds were feeding their flocks when they had their glorious revelation. He said, God called the 4 apostles from the fishery, and Matthew from the receipt of custom, Amos from among the herdsmen of Tekoa, Moses from keeping Jethro's sheep, Gideon from the threshing floor. God never encourages idleness, and he despises not persons in the lowliest or meanest employments. God's looking for people who are already busy doing stuff. The folks who are already busy, that's the ones he always reaches out and taps and says, I need you. You're the ones who want. So you're looking for people who are already busy, already successful, already producing fruit, already have good fruit, you know, like the vine and the fig and all. They're already producing good fruit. That's the people you want to go for. Now, interestingly, go back to this choose out. Sam Adams talked about this process of choosing out because the founders used that Bible verse as the basis of why we do the elections the way we do. But they win at elections a little different than the way we do right now. What they did was they give you a blank piece of paper for the ballot, and it didn't have names on it. It had positions on it. Who do you want for governor? Who do you want for state senator, for state rep? Who do you want for mayor? Who do you want for city council? Who do you want for school board? And you would go in with that blank piece of paper and you would fill in the names that you thought would be the best governor, the best school board president, the best mayor. And after all those names came back and you looked at them, they would figure out who got the most votes, and they would go to you and say, John Smith, the people want you to be governor. You want to be governor? You didn't know you were running for office. Now, the reason that happened, look how Sam Adams explains this. Sam Adams says, it bodes very ill to government when men are exalted to places of high trust through their own seeking of the office. See, if I have to tell you, I'm your leader, follow me, we got trouble. If you don't know I'm your leader. See, people know their own leaders. We recognize those from among us who have leadership capabilities, who have the right attitude, who are servant leaders, not masters. We got servant leaders. See, he says, it bodes very ill to government when men are exalted in places of trust to their own seeking of office. He only fills a place with dignity who's invited to it by his fellow citizens from the experience they have had of his adequate abilities. He says, whoever interposes in elections with his own seeking of office for himself is to be feared that he will in time become a dangerous party man. He ought therefore to be despised and intruder. If you get in because you put yourself in or you work to get yourself in, you'll be loyal to the wrong groups, the wrong issues. You'll be a party person, be a party hack rather than a servant of the people. See, that's why we always didn't put people on the ballots. You're not supposed to promote yourself for this. People recognize, we're told in Acts, they said, hey, go choose out from among you men full of the Holy Ghost, men of good reputation. Put them to be the ones who administer these programs. Remember that back in Acts? That's what we did. We went and chose leaders because we recognized leaders. Same thing was told by Noah Webster, founding father, who gave us Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 8 of the Constitution, but he's a great educator, wrote so many of our textbooks. Here's what he told students. He said, students, as a general rule, it may be safely affirmed that the man who never plots and schemes for public office may be most safely entrusted with office. He says, such a man cannot desire promotion unless he receives it from the respectable part of the community, for it considers no other promotion to be honorable. You see, the people who are the best leaders are the ones who don't want to be there at all. Because when they get there, they're not there for money, they're not there for fame, they're not there for their own purpose. When they get there, they'll actually do what they were put there to do. And that's why it's so cool that George Washington quit office every time he got the stinking chance. I mean, he retired so many times, and the people kept saying, no, we need you back, we need you president now, we need whatever it was, and he kept coming. Patrick Henry's a great example. He was elected several times, 4 times, I think it was, the governor of Virginia. And again, not running for office, but the people chose him, and so they went to him and said, you're governor. You want to be governor? Not particularly, but if that's what they want me to do, I'll serve. And he was so good that they elected him again, and so good they elected him again. And this is when he was really late in life, really old in life. And when it came for the next election, he said, please don't elect me again. He said, I've got 19 kids, 81 grandkids. I want to be at home with them. Please don't elect me again. And they elected him again. I mean, they knew who were good leaders. And so the best people in office are the ones who don't want to be there, but they will serve. And see, this is the other thing we taught in the founding era, that if they come to you and say, hey, they've chosen you for school board president, you're going to serve? You're not allowed to say no. Now, why can't I say no? Because that's pure selfishness. You're more concerned about yourself than they recognize. They're saying, we need you to come serve us. We need your skills. No, I'm not going to give you God gave me the skill set, but I'm not going to share it with you. Benjamin Rush said it this way. He said, a citizen must love private life, but he must decline no station, however public or responsible might be, when called to it by the votes of his fellow citizens. He said, and he quoted the scripture here, remember that none lives to himself. That's Romans 14:7. Even our old age is not our property. All of its fruits of wisdom experience belong to the public. God didn't put you here to serve yourself. He put you here to serve others. And if people come to you and say, we need you to serve us, you're not allowed to say, no, I don't want to serve you. I'll pick and choose who I serve. Not optional. See, that's why we had such different political philosophy back in the founding, because we used Bible verses as the base of what we did. Imagine that. See, now we're told Christians shouldn't get involved. Well, because Christians aren't involved, we got the mess we've got. You go back to Christians being involved, you get a whole different outcome. So choose out. Now, interestingly, who does the choosing here? We think the people had elections. Moses made it real clear, no, that was advice given to me. Now I went out and chose the candidates and put them up, and you guys, he made it real clear in Deuteronomy, you guys are the ones who voted the candidates in office. I went and recruited the right people for you and put some people up there, but you made the choice. You chose Joshua, and you chose Caleb, and you chose all these guys. I just recruited them. It's interesting that you find that is the biblical model. For example, when Saul became king, he was anointed by who? The chief justice of the court of Israel? No. It was a spiritual leader. It was the prophet of Israel. It was Samuel who did so. Same thing, Samuel is the one who anointed David to be the civil leader. It was Nathan and Gad who anointed Solomon to be the civil leader. It was the spiritual people who went and chose out the right people to be in civil office. We didn't let the secular people choose that. The spiritual leaders, the pastors, the prophets went and chose those who were supposed to be ones in office. Now, having said that, why don't we do that today? Given the model we have of God's always spiritual leaders were the ones choosing and recruiting people for office. And by the way, let me step back a bit. I've held political office in Texas for 9 years. I've trained about 2,000 candidates for office. I do a whole lot of political work. There's probably about 120 members of Congress that I consider to be very good friends. I just finished a congressional report this morning for one of the committees on a hearing they've got going. And so I'm very involved in this arena. And over the years, our technology has now become so remarkable that, for example, Texas is the most pro-life state in the United States. We've passed more pro-life laws than any other state. And we have really good pro-life groups there. And with technology, what's happened is over this last session of our state legislature, I probably got 50 emails telling me at 2:30 this afternoon they're having a hearing in this committee on this amendment to this pro-life bill. Now, what you need to do, here's your state representative. Click this thing right here. It will call your state representative. Then you tell him at 2:30 this afternoon to vote no on Amendment 223 to primary bill. And it's just really good. All I got to do is just click or call, and it tells that member of Congress exactly what I want them to do on that bill. I don't even have to understand the process. So I got probably 50 emails this time saying, call your rep this. And I did not call my rep a single time. And it's not because I'm not pro-life, because I am. The reason I did not call my rep was I'm the guy who recruited for him for office. I put him in office because he is a pro-life guy who knows exactly what marriage is. And see, this is an axiom you learn real quick in politics. What you want to do is you want to elect people you don't have to lobby. If I have to lobby you, I've already lost the battle. If I have to call you and say vote pro-life, we've already lost that battle. If I have to call you and say, make sure you vote for marriage as a man and a woman, we've already lost the battle. See, you got to put the right philosophy of people in office where you don't have to lobby those that you elect. Now, the only way you can elect leaders you don't have to lobby is you have to recruit leaders you don't have to lobby. That goes back to us. This is where the church can really step up. We can say, you know, you've been faithful in this church for a number of years, but you really ought to be on the public utility district. They're so screwed up over there. They need your leadership. They need your persona. You know the Word of God. You know exactly how that's operates. See, we need to be recruiting those kind of people for office rather than letting thorn bushes step forward and say, I'll be happy to be your leader. You know, we can't do that. So wrapping this thing down, let me take it back to Charles Finney, give you a couple of challenges to close this thing out. Charles Finney, interesting what he said about this aspect of Christians and pastors and political involvement. He said the church must take right ground in regard to politics. He said politics are part of a religion in countries this. Why is that? Because, again, it's a stewardship thing. God gave it to us. Luke 19:30, he said, you guys occupy till I come. When I get back, I'm going to ask you, what'd you do with that government I gave you? And you're going to have to tell me. So he says, it's politics, it's part of a religion in countries this, and Christians must do their duty to their country as part of their duty to God. It's a stewardship that we have. He says, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. Now, this little statement that he just made is part of a book that he did. And by the way, let me back up and say, Charles Finney, great revivalist, was involved in the Second and Third Great Awakenings. That was a 77-year revival in American history. We keep praying for revival in America. How would you like to have a 77-year revival? Charles Finney said, based on what the Bible teaches and what we see in history, there are definite things you can do to bring a revival. You don't just have to pray and sit back and wait for God to do something. There are definite steps that you can take to produce a revival in your country. And so that's what he had, was revival lectures. Here's what you do from the Bible to create a revival in your country. This statement right there was part of revival lecture number 15. It's part of what you can do to have a revival. Do you know what the title of that lecture was? It's called Hindrances to Revival. He said, if you want to hinder revival in your country, refuse to be involved in politics. Why? because then you'll have people like San Antonio. And what happens is we bring people to Christ, and what do they want to do? They want to share their faith publicly, but when they try to do so, it's now a $500 a day fine for doing so. You know how hard it is to keep a revival going when people want to express themselves and you've got policies that won't let them express themselves? You know how hard it is to keep a revival going if you want to have a Bible study at your home and you find out you have to spend 90 days in jail for having a Bible study in your home? See, if you refuse to get involved in politics and you let these wicked policies get in there, it will crush a revival. The very things that a revival brings are people who want to openly express their faith, and we've got a policy that says you can't do that. We're going to squish it down. By the way, if you want to see some of those examples, go to religioushostility.org. It lists 1,200 examples from recent years of where Christians have been singled out and targeted and not allowed to express their faith. It goes on all the time. As I mentioned, I've been involved in 7 cases, U.S. Supreme Court. They all deal with some form of public religious expression. If you want information on this, I'll send you to nationalblackroberegiment.org. That's a website that is saying, preachers, we got to be the same Black Robe Regiment we were back then. By the way, if you want to have a lot of fun, we have applications and tools on there. We even have an app that you can put on your Facebook that will check every single one of your friends to see if they're registered to vote. It will tell you which of your friends are not registered to vote. That'll be a lot of fun. Then you can send them a message and say, you knothead, what were you thinking? You've got to be involved. It allows you to specifically, we have the largest database in the United States, 200 million folks. We got all public records, all the people who have voted, and we have all the Secretary of State's information in there. We can take your church list. We can tell you in your church list what percentage of your church is registered to vote and how many actually voted in the last election. And I guarantee you people, oh, my people are really involved. I talk about this all the time. You know, I don't know of anybody more involved in this arena than I am. I'm really involved. Wall builders, that's what we exist for, is to get people involved. I took my wall builders list and ran it through that database. 65% of the people in our database are not even registered to vote. Why would you be part of wall builders and not be registered to vote? Well, probably the same in your church too. So we actually have tools where you can check the voter registration in your church and see how many. We don't care about keeping the names. We'll just send you back a pie chart that shows you what the percentages are. You may want to go have some visits with some folks and kind of talk to them after you get that list. So there's that. Final thing I'll do is, if you're interested in this kind of information, on the table out back we have what's called the Founders Bible. What we've done for 25 years is collect writings of the Founding Fathers, and I will tell you that those writings developed my worldview more than anything I've done in my lifetime, because I had never seen how politics apply, the Bible applied to politics and education, so much else. Give you an example of one Founding Father, a guy named Matthew Maury. He is called the father of oceanography. Now, he's the guy who came up with the charts that we still use today. I don't know if you know there's jet streams in the ocean. If you get in a jet stream in the ocean, it'll get you to Europe a week faster than coming, you know. And so if you look at these oceanographic charts, they chart every direction of every current in the ocean, and that's where liners will get over in those jet streams. You know where he found this Founding Father back in the day? You know where he found that? He was reading in Psalms 8, verse 8, and as he was reading in Psalms 8, verse 8, God said in the Scripture, I have put pathways in the sea. And he goes, pathways in the sea? What path? He was a ship captain. And he's the one who discovered that. Reading the Bible, he found that specific application. So the father of oceanography comes from there. You also have folks like Alexander Hamilton, who specifically pointed to Luke 11:20 as the reason we have a written Constitution. By the way, James Madison did the same thing. Most folks have never even thought about Luke 11:20. You have John Adams, who has 3 writings showing how that Jeremiah 17:9 is why we have separation of powers in the Constitution. And I will tell you, I struggled over that for a while. It took me a while to figure out how Jeremiah 17:9 had anything to do with separation of powers until I read his letters where he explained it. He explained why they did that. And then Jeremiah 17:9 took on a whole new complexion to me. I saw things I'd never seen. They saw when they studied the Bible. You even have Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin started the first health care system in America, and he did so on the basis of Luke 10:35. To this day, that's the oldest hospital in America. It still has Luke 10:35 on its logo. It still has Luke 10:35 as its motto. Healthcare started out of Luke 10:35. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, there's the Founders Bible. There's all sorts of other stuff out there that you may be interested in as well. I've got to leave this afternoon. I've got another meeting back in Texas tonight, so I won't be here that long. But if you're interested, it's out there. But thank you guys for letting me share with you. God bless you.
Man. You know what, David, you got just like 3 minutes. We're just, we'll do 3 questions. You probably got hundreds, but David's got other things, we've got other, but just three questions real quick. We'll right here's number 1, and then number 2's down here. Yes, sir.
I can get this right. See, a lot of the founding fathers said, okay, in the Constitution, you had to believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, today, so many churches are redefining Christianity. You know, you can ordain gays, you can gay marriage in the church. So Christianity is being redefined by non-Christian principles. So you get those people saying, well, we got to vote people that believe in our Christian beliefs, which aren't really true biblical beliefs.
Yeah, great observation. I'll do a couple of presentations exactly on that. Let me back up to put this in perspective. One of my very good friends is George Barna, who has done tens of thousands of polls. George Barna says that in 70 different moral categories, and you think of 70 moral categories, all right? Just, you got adultery, you got premarital sexual activity, you got pornography, you got lying, cheating, stealing, you've got, think of 70, I don't think of 70 categories or more. George Barna, tens of thousands of polls, says in 70 different moral categories in polling, they cannot find any statistical difference between Christians and non-Christians when it comes to behavior. Actually, the highest divorce rate in the United States is among born-again Christians. 87% of Christians who got divorced did so after they became Christians. So apparently, divorce is part of the new life in Christ. That's not biblical. No. You know, Jesus got that. So what's happened is we have this thing of we're not biblical. I'm part of a group right now we're working with. Barton is part of that group. We call 500 to 600 churches every day. Churches. And we ask churches 5 questions. And we're looking for what we call theologically conservative churches. We're saying, do you believe the Bible applies to every aspect of life and living? Do you think the Bible addresses issues like abortion? Does it address issues like marriage? Do you encourage your people to vote? And should the church be involved outside the 4 walls of the church? Those 5 questions. We're only getting 30% of churches that agree with those 5 questions. Then among those 5 questions, we then ask those pastors, all right, if you think the Bible addresses abortion or addresses homosexuality, have you preached about it in the last year? Have you even mentioned it from the pulpit once in the last year? And we're finding that only 25% of that group has even mentioned it once in the last year. So 25% of 30% puts us now at about 7.5% of churches in America mention abortion or marriage once in the past year. It's hard for our people to be biblical when we don't talk about what the Bible talks about. So that's part of the issue we've got. The other issue we have now, Dr. Benjamin Rush, I talked about Father Public School and the Constitution. One of the things he did in 1791, March 10, 1791, was he gave a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of public schools. Dozen reasons. He said, if you take the Bible out of public schools, if children do not read the Bible when they're young, they seldom read it when they're old. What's happened is we've taken the Bible out of schools. We now suffer from biblical literacy in this nation. We have 95% of Christians who have never read through the Bible cover to cover once in their lifetime. Now, how can you be biblical when you don't know what's in the book? So I'm at the point where the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, I don't even talk about being Christian. I think that's a worthless term. I talk about being biblical. There's a whole big difference between being Christian and being biblical. Christian right now is a label that we wear. You know, biblical, I judge you by your fruits. Christian, I don't care what label you wear. I judge you by your fruits. I've got a Jewish rabbi friend I would put in office 1,000 times quicker than most of my Christian friends because he's more biblical than they are. He knows the Bible much better than they do. So that's where I had is I don't care about Christian. I care about biblical. You do it God's way, you will get God's results. Just real simple stuff.
Excellent. Excellent. Right down here.
You know, interesting question. There is only one Constitution in the United States that's older than the U.S. Constitution, and that's the Constitution of Massachusetts. It was written in 1780 by those founding fathers I showed you, by those ministers I showed you, and that is still in effect today. Now, nobody in Massachusetts uses that Constitution because that Constitution explicitly sets forth marriage as a man and a woman. And Massachusetts was the first state to say, nah, we've moved beyond that. See, it doesn't matter how good your Constitution is, it matters how good your leaders are. Right. So the Constitution of Massachusetts is still in effect. Several of those other constitutions went by the wayside in the 60s when the judicial activism, the Supreme Court in the 60s, the court, for example, struck down the provision in Maryland's Constitution, you have to believe in God to hold office. Well, the Founding Fathers put that in there. What do you mean it's unconstitutional? Well, we're in a more enlightened era and more enlightened age, and we don't think God's important anymore. So the Supreme Court did that, so a number of the constitutions were changed at that point in time. But again, that goes back to, and by the way, you want a biblical reason for being involved. Isaiah 126 is the biblical reason for Christians being involved in politics. Isaiah 126, God's talking to Isaiah. They've gone through a really bad time as a nation. God's going to bring them back. He says, here's how I'll do it. I will give you judges as at the beginning and lawyers as at the first. He said, then you'll be called a nation of righteousness. Now, God ties the righteousness of a community to the type of judges you have in that community. Exactly. All the issues we deal with, the righteousness came out of the Supreme Court. They didn't come out of the legislatures. It's the court that gave us abortion on demand. It's the court that told us homosexual marriage. It was courts that told us you can't have a prayer at a football game. It was courts that told us you can't have the Bible at schools. Those weren't legislative decisions. Righteousness comes from judges. The number one issue for any person voting in any federal election should be, what kind of judges am I going to get? When I look at a president of the United States, I ought to be asking Ezra 7:25, which says appoint judges that know the laws of God. Will you do that? Because if I don't get those kind of judges, I'm in serious trouble. Psalms 2:10-12 says, you judges of the earth, fear the Lord. Kiss the Son, S-O-N. Kiss the Son lest his wrath be triggered against you. And so, in other words, if you don't honor God, he's going to nail you. And it's just real simple. And that's what he told judges. That's the directive to judges. So that's why voting judges is most important. So answer is most of those constitutions have gone by the wayside because of judicial activism. The Massachusetts Constitution is still in place, but nobody reads it anymore because they just don't elect people up there that even know what that Constitution said.
What's important is the people we put in there.
That's exactly right.
That's it.
Exactly it.
One more, Sonia, and Dave's got to go.
Yes. Yeah, there's a Pastors Council with Dave Welch. He's got a Houston area and Texas area, and there are now a lot of really good groups going like that. Jim Garlow has 32,000 pastors organized nationally. In Pennsylvania, Sam Rohrer has 7,000 Pennsylvania pastors organized. We've got about 15,000 on our list that we deal with. And what we're doing is groups at Vision America, they've got about 10,000. American Family Association got about 15,000. American Renewal Project's got about 15,000 pastors. We're bringing all those pastors groups together into the same, one thing Christians don't do well is we don't play together in the sandbox well. We're too turf conscious. And so now we're getting those groups coming together, and we're cooperating on doing the same things across the country. The other story on San Antonio is we're now training 300 churches in San Antonio how to recruit candidates for office, how to get their people turned out, how to take the city council back and get a hold. And the problem with city council ordinance is simple. You just get a new council, they'll get rid of the old ordinance. It's a piece of cake. But that comes back to the churches having greater than a 2% turnout and having the right candidates to vote for. Because if you have a 50% turnout instead of a 2% turnout, but you're just choosing between the bad and the worst, and that doesn't help you. You got to have a good candidate there, which means you have to recruit good candidates to put on there. So that's part of what we're starting to see pastors groups doing now, is getting a whole lot more involved and understanding the process, how to use the process, to take the process to be able to get the right results.
Thank you, David. Let's give David a big hand clap.